My name is Sophia Walker, and at 28 years old, I never expected to be fighting for my own inheritance. You have 1 week to leave. My brother Eric smirked across our grandmother Eleanor's antique dining table. Mom and Dad just watched in silence, eyes fixed on their plates. The betrayal stung worse than the words themselves. Little did they know, I had already pulled out the property records from my bag. Actually, you all have 24 hours. Their forks dropped when they realized grandmother had outsmarted them all. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if family drama is your thing. Growing up in Millfield, Connecticut, I was always the odd one out in our family. While my parents, Margaret and Richard Walker, doted on my older brother Eric, I found solace in books, art, and the wisdom of my grandmother, Eleanor. Our family home, a sprawling Victorian built in the late 1800s, had been in the Walker family for generations. The house itself was a character in our family story. Creaky floorboards that announced your presence, a winding staircase with hand-carved banisters, and rooms that held decades of memories, both sweet and bitter. I left Millfield the day after high school graduation, determined to forge my own path. Architecture had always been my passion. Inspired by the intricate details of our family home, Boston welcomed me with open arms, and I thrived at MIT, earning my degree with honors. The further I advanced in my career, the more distant my relationship with my family became, except for grandmother Eleanor. Eric never left Millfield. While I was designing modern structures and sustainable living spaces in Boston, he was working at our father's insurance firm, playing golf at the country club, and positioning himself as the beautiful son. My parents never missed an opportunity to remind me how Eric had stayed loyal to the family, unlike their daughter who abandoned them for city life. "Your brother takes care of us," Mom would say during our infrequent phone calls. "He comes by every Sunday for dinner. He helps your father with the yard work." What they never mentioned was how Eric had slowly been taking control of family decisions, particularly regarding finances and property. He'd convinced our parents to add him as a signatory on their bank accounts just in case of emergency. He'd suggested they consult him before making any major purchases. And most importantly, he'd been dropping hints about the family home for years. Grandmother Eleanor saw through him. At 87, her mind remained sharp as a tack, and her piercing blue eyes missed nothing. During my visits, which I maintained despite my parents' coldness, she would squeeze my hand and whisper, "This house has eyes and ears, Sophia. Be careful what you say around certain people." The economic downturn had hit Millfield hard over the past decade. What was once a thriving small town had become a shell of its former self, with Main Street featuring more empty storefronts than businesses. Property values had plummeted, except for historic homes like ours, which had become even more valuable to developers looking to create boutique hotels or upscale apartments. I'd been away for 3 years straight before grandmother's passing. My architecture firm had sent me to oversee projects in Chicago, then Seattle, and finally a 6-month stint in London. Each time I'd planned to visit Millfield, something came up. A project deadline, a client emergency, or just plain fear of facing the family dynamics I'd escaped. When the call came about grandmother Eleanor, I was in a taxi heading to a client meeting in downtown Boston. Dad's voice was flat when he said, "Your grandmother passed in her sleep last night. The funeral is Saturday." No emotion, no acknowledgement of what she'd meant to me. Just facts and a date. What he didn't say was that grandmother had asked for me repeatedly in her final days. I learned this from Mrs. Patterson, Eleanor's nurse, who called me separately. "She had something important to tell you, dear. She made me promise to let you know she left something for you in her writing desk," the small drawer with the key she kept on her necklace. Before heading to Millfield, I'd made one stop at my attorney's office. The documents he provided confirmed what grandmother had told me during my last visit, though at the time I hadn't fully understood the implications. Now, with the papers safely tucked in my briefcase, I returned to the town I'd left behind, unaware of the storm that awaited me. The moment I pulled into the driveway of the Walker family home, I knew things had changed. Eric's sleek black Audi was parked in what had always been grandmother's spot. The flower beds she had tenderly maintained were now overgrown with weeds. The porch swing, where we'd spent countless summer evenings talking about life, was gone. Mom answered the door with a perfunctory hug. "You're in the blue guest room," she said. "Not the bedroom I'd grown up in. Eric and Jessica are using your old room when they stay over with the kids." Dad nodded from his armchair, barely looking up from his newspaper. "Good drive. No, I've missed you." Or, "It's good to see you." Just practical questions and statements of fact. Eric arrived an hour later with his wife Jessica and their 2 children, Madison and Connor. He'd gained weight since I'd last seen him, his face fuller under his carefully styled hair. The gold watch on his wrist caught the light as he gave me a cursory hug. "The prodigal daughter returns," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Must have been quite the important meeting to Miss Grandma's last days. The barb stung, designed to do exactly that. Jessica, ever the peacemaker, quickly interjected with questions about Boston and my work. But Eric cut her off. "We're not here to discuss Sophia's glamorous life," he said. "We have funeral arrangements to finalize." Throughout that first evening, I noticed how everyone deferred to Eric. Mom asked his opinion on the funeral flowers. Dad consulted him about which family members needed to be called. Even the funeral director who stopped by addressed most of his questions to my brother, rather than to all of us collectively. "We've already selected the casket," Eric informed me when I asked about the arrangements. "No need for your input at this late stage." Later, I found myself wandering into grandmother's room, now stripped of many personal items. Her favorite Afghan was missing from the foot of the bed. The collection of antique silver brushes had been removed from her vanity. The walls, once covered with family photographs, now held only faint rectangles where frames had hung. "Looking for something?" Eric's voice startled me from the doorway. "Just remembering," I said. "What happened to all her things?" "Mom and I sorted through them already. Important items are safely stored. The rest will go to charity after the funeral." Without asking me if there was anything I wanted to keep, Eric shrugged. "You weren't here. Decisions had to be made." I noticed a small wooden box on grandmother's nightstand and reached for it, remembering it had contained her collection of vintage brooches. "Don't touch that," Eric said sharply. "Jessica has already claimed it." That night, I waited until the house was quiet before slipping back into grandmother's room. The key Mrs. Patterson mentioned had been removed from Eleanor's belongings, but I found the small writing desk intact in the corner. After 20 minutes of careful searching, I discovered that the bottom of the drawer had a false bottom. Beneath it lay a sealed envelope with my name written in grandmother's elegant script, along with a small key that unlocked her safe deposit box at Millfield Community Bank. The next morning brought the first of several tense family meals. As I entered the kitchen, Eric and Mom abruptly stopped talking. "Toast?" Mom offered mechanically. "What were you discussing?" I asked directly. "Funeral details?" Eric answered too quickly. "Nothing for you to worry about." Later, I overheard Eric on the phone in Dad's study. The door not quite closed. "Yes, as soon as the funeral is over. The property has excellent development potential. No, there won't be any complications from other family members." When he emerged, I pretended to be examining a family photo on the wall. "Making plans already?" I asked casually. "Just tying up loose ends," he replied, tucking his phone into his pocket. "Grandmother left some financial matters that need attention." "Interesting," I said. "I wasn't aware you were handling her estate." Eric's smile tightened. "Someone has to take responsibility. We can't all run off to play architect in the big city." On the day before the funeral, I visited the Millfield Community Bank. The contents of grandmother's safe deposit box confirmed everything. The envelope had suggested property deeds, legal documents, and a letter explaining her decisions in detail. I made copies of everything before returning the originals to the box. My attorney had advised me to wait until after the funeral to reveal what I knew. "Let the family have their time to grieve," he suggested. "The legal matters can wait." That evening, I found an old photograph album tucked away in the library bookshelf. It contained pictures I'd never seen. Grandmother as a young woman standing proudly in front of the house, a deed document visible in her hands. There were newspaper clippings, too, about how Eleanor Walker had fought to keep the family property during difficult financial times in the 1970s, when my grandfather had wanted to sell. "She saved this house once before," I whispered to myself. The funeral passed in a blur of black clothes, solemn faces, and platitudes about a life well lived. I stood apart from my family at the cemetery, watching as they accepted condolences from town residents who barely acknowledged my presence. The city daughter, I heard someone whisper, barely knew her grandmother. If only they knew the truth of our relationship, the long letters we'd exchanged, the phone calls late into the night when I needed guidance, the way she'd supported my dreams when everyone else had tried to clip my wings. The day after the funeral, Mom announced we would have a proper family dinner to discuss moving forward. The dining room table was set with grandmother's best china and crystal glasses that caught the late afternoon light. The formality of the setting suggested this was no ordinary meal. Eric and Jessica arrived precisely at 6 m. Their children left with the babysitter. Dad uncorked a bottle of wine that had been saving for a special occasion, though no one clarified what the occasion might be. The tension in the room was palpable as we took our seats. Eric at the head of the table where grandfather used to sit, Mom and Dad flanking him with Jessica and me across from each other. The first course, grandmother's recipe for butternut squash soup, was served in uncomfortable silence. Mom attempted small talk about the funeral arrangements, commenting on the lovely turnout and beautiful flowers. It was during the main course of roast beef and potatoes that Eric finally addressed what was clearly the real purpose of the dinner. He set down his fork deliberately, took a sip of wine, and cleared his throat. Now that we've paid our respects to grandmother, he began, his tone businesslike. We need to discuss practical matters. Mom and Dad exchanged glances, but said nothing. As you know, Eric continued, Jessica and I have been considering a larger home for our growing family. The kids need more space, and with the baby coming, he paused to allow Jessica's automatic smile at the mention of her pregnancy. Congratulations, I said, genuinely surprised by the news. I didn't know you were expecting. We announced it at Christmas, Jessica said softly. You weren't here. Another reminder of my absence, another subtle jab. Anyway, Eric continued. After discussing it with Mom and Dad, we've decided the most sensible solution is for us to move into this house. It's got the space we need, and it keeps the property in the family. I looked at my parents. You're moving out? Dad studied his plate. We've been thinking about downsizing. The maintenance on this place is becoming too much. We found a nice condo in that new development by the golf course, Mom added, not meeting my eyes. Eric smiled. The picture of reasonableness. It makes perfect sense, Sophia. Mom and Dad get a more manageable space. We keep the family home. Everyone wins. And where do I fit into this plan, I asked. Though I already knew the answer, Eric's expression shifted to one of feigned concern. Well, that's what we need to discuss. Obviously, you'll need some time to collect any remaining belongings. My belongings from my home. Let's be realistic, Eric said, his voice hardening slightly. This hasn't been your home for years. You've made your life in Boston. It's still my family home, I insisted. A home you visit, once every few years? Eric scoffed. Look, we're not throwing you out on the street. We're just being practical. I turned to my parents, and you both agree with this. Mom fiddled with her napkin. Eric and Jessica need the space, dear. They have children to consider. And what about what grandmother would have wanted, I asked at this. Eric's facade of reasonableness cracked slightly. Grandmother is gone, Sophia. The living need to make decisions for the living. She loved this house, I said quietly. She would have wanted it preserved, not torn apart for your renovations. Eric's eyebrows shot up. How did you know about the renovations? I didn't answer. The plans are quite tasteful, Jessica interjected quickly. We're preserving all the historical features except for the east wing, I said. The part with grandmother's rooms in the library. You're planning to demolish those for a modern addition. Eric's face flushed. You've been snooping through my things. I overheard your call with the developer, I said calmly, and I saw the preliminary sketches in Dad's study. The atmosphere at the table had grown decidedly colder. Eric sat down his wine glass with a thud that made Jessica jump. You've always had a problem with boundaries, Sophia, always thinking you know better than everyone else. Well, this time it doesn't matter what you think. His voice had taken on the cruel edge I remembered from childhood arguments. You have 1 week to leave, to collect whatever you think still belongs to you and go back to your life in Boston. The smirk that accompanied this pronouncement sent a wave of familiar hurt through me, the same feeling I'd experienced countless times growing up as the less favored child. But this time, there was something different. This time, I had grandmother's documents in my bag. Mom and Dad just watched in silence, eyes fixed on their plates again. The betrayal stung worse than Eric's words. Their silence was complicity. Their averted gazes, an admission. 1 week, Eric repeated, clearly enjoying what he perceived as his moment of triumph. I'm being generous considering the circumstances. I reached down for my bag beside my chair, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make. Grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in my ear. Some battles choose you, Sophia. Be brave enough to fight them. The manila envelope made a soft thud as I placed it on the dining table. Eric eyed it suspiciously, fork poised midway to his mouth. What's that supposed to be? He asked. Property records, I replied calmly, though my heart was racing. And grandmother's will, the official one. Not whatever version you might have been showing, Mom and Dad. The flash of uncertainty that crossed Eric's face told me everything I needed to know. He had indeed been misrepresenting grandmother's wishes. I have no idea what you're talking about, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I opened the envelope and slid out the documents one by one, arranging them neatly on the table between the crystal water glasses and silver candlesticks. Deed to the Walker family home. Transferred to Sophia Eleanor Walker 3 years ago. Notarized. Filed with the county clerk, completely legal and binding. Mom gasped. Dad's face went pale. Jessica looked from Eric to me in confusion. 3 years ago, Dad asked. That's impossible. Your grandmother would have told us. She did tell someone, I said quietly. She told me. The memory of that conversation flooded back with perfect clarity. It had been during my last visit to Millfield before my work trips had made visits impossible. Grandmother had asked me to walk with her in the garden, ostensibly to discuss the heritage roses she'd been cultivating for decades. Sophia, she had said, settling onto the stone bench by the fountain. I need to talk to you about the house. I'd assume she wanted my professional opinion on some renovation or repair. Is something wrong with the structure? No, dear, something is wrong with the family. Her directness had surprised me. I've been watching Eric's behavior these past few years. The way he's manipulating your parents, the comments about what a burden this house is on them, his suggestions about selling to developers. He wouldn't, I'd protested, though without much conviction. He would, and he's planning to, Grandmother had said firmly. I've overheard his phone calls. I've seen the brochures from that resort development company he's been meeting with. She'd taken my hands in hers, her skin paper thin, but her grip surprisingly strong. This house has been in my family for 5 generations. My grandmother left it to me directly, bypassing my brothers, who would have sold it in a heartbeat. Now I'm doing the same. What do you mean? I've transferred ownership to you, Sophia, not in my will, which could be contested, but as a direct gift. It's already done. The paperwork was filed last month. I'd been speechless, stunned by the magnitude of what she was telling me. Why not tell Mom and Dad or Eric? Grandmother's blue eyes had hardened because they would try to talk me out of it, or worse, pressure me to undo it. Eric especially. He's counting on this house as his inheritance, not because he loves it, but because of what he can get for it. But why me? I'd asked. I don't even live here anymore. Because you understand what this house means. Not just the building, but the history, the memories. You see beyond market value to true value. She'd squeezed my hands. And because you're strong enough to stand up to them when the time comes. Back at the dinner table, Eric was sputtering in disbelief. This is forgery. It has to be. Grandmother would never have done this behind our backs. Behind your back? You mean? I corrected. She knew exactly what you were planning, Eric. The meetings with Lakeside Developments, the plans to turn this into luxury condos, all of it. That's a lie. Eric slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes rattle. We were going to live here for the family. After you gutted the place and rebuilt it to your specifications, I countered. After you erased everything that made this house special to Grandmother, Dad was examining the deed document, his insurance background making him familiar with such paperwork. This appears legitimate, he said slowly. The signature is definitely your grandmother's. Eric snatched the paper from him. There must be some mistake or some way to invalidate this. She was elderly, possibly not of sound mind. Her doctor performed a cognitive assessment the same day she signed the transfer, I said, sliding another document forward. As you can see, she was declared fully competent. Mom was crying softly. Whether from shock or disappointment, I couldn't tell. Jessica sat frozen, her dinner forgotten. Why would she do this? Mom asked. Why wouldn't she tell us? Because she knew what would happen, I said gently. She knew Eric would try to pressure her to change her mind. She knew you and Dad would take his side as you always have. The harsh truth hung in the air between us. Decades of family dynamics laid bare in a single statement. This is ridiculous, Eric said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. I'll contest this. I'll get lawyers involved. You're welcome to try, I replied. But grandmother made sure everything was legally watertight. She even recorded a video statement explaining her decision, which my attorney has in safekeeping. Eric's face had gone from red to white. Your attorney? How long have you known about this? Since she did it, I admitted, but I never thought it would come to this. I never imagined you'd try to force me out of my own family home a week after grandmother's funeral. Actually, I continued, gathering the documents back into a neat pile. Given what's happened tonight, I think it's best if you all make arrangements to leave, not in a week. Tomorrow, Jessica echoed, speaking for the first time since the revelation. But we can't possibly. 24 hours, I said, echoing Eric's earlier ultimatum. I think that's generous considering the circumstances. The three of them stared at me in shock, forks suspended in midair, as if they couldn't believe what was happening. The tables had turned so completely that they seemed unable to process the reversal. You can't be serious, Eric finally managed. Throw your own family out. I'm not throwing anyone out, I clarified. I'm simply exercising my rights as the legal owner of this property. Rights that grandmother entrusted to me precisely because she feared this exact scenario. The remainder of the dinner passed in stunned silence. The dessert grandmother's apple pie recipe remained untouched as the reality of the situation sank in. I had become, in the space of a few minutes, not the family outcast, but the family power broker. The sensation was unfamiliar and not entirely comfortable. As Eric and Jessica prepared to leave, Eric pulled me aside in the hallway, his expression a mixture of rage and disbelief. This isn't over, he hissed. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you're doing. This house is a money pit. The taxes alone will bankrupt you. Funny, I replied. Grandmother managed just fine on her teacher's pension. I think I'll manage on my architect's salary. You'll regret this, he warned, grabbing his coat. When you're alone in this big, empty house, you'll realize what you've done to this family. As their car disappeared down the driveway, I turned to find Mom and Dad standing awkwardly in the foyer, looking lost in the house that had been their home for over 30 years. Did you really mean it? Mom asked tearfully. About us leaving tomorrow? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with years of neglect and favoritism, but also with shared history and the complicated love that binds families even through betrayal. Morning light streamed through the stained glass panels of the front door, casting colored patterns across the foyer's hardwood floor. I'd spent a restless night in the blue guest room, replaying the dinner conversation and questioning my ultimatum. The satisfaction of standing up to Eric had given way to uncertainty about the path forward with my parents. The smell of coffee drew me to the kitchen where I found Dad already dressed, sipping from his usual mug at the breakfast table. Your mother's upstairs packing, he said, without preamble. We found a furnished rental by the golf course. 3-month lease to start while we figure things out. I poured myself coffee, noting he'd made enough for 2. A small gesture, but significant. Dad, about last night. I called the family lawyer this morning, he interrupted. The documents are legitimate. The house is legally yours. I sat across from him. I never wanted it to happen like this. Dad sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. Your grandmother always did have her own ideas about things, stubborn as they come. She was trying to protect the house, I said, from Eric's development plans. Maybe. Dad stared into his coffee. Or maybe she was trying to protect something else entirely. Before I could ask what he meant, the doorbell rang. Through the stained glass, I could make out Eric's distinctive silhouette. Dad grimaced. He called at 6:30 this morning, said he was bringing his lawyer by. I told him it wasn't a good idea, but I squared my shoulders and went to answer the door. Eric stood on the porch with a thin man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as James Blackwell from the firm of Blackwell, Porter, and Schmidt. Miss Walker, the lawyer began. My client wishes to discuss the property transfer executed by Eleanor Walker. There are some concerning irregularities. There are no irregularities, I interrupted. And unless you have a court order, this is private property and you're here at my discretion. Eric pushed past me into the foyer. This is still my parents' house, regardless of what paperwork you've dug up. Actually, Dad said, appearing from the kitchen, according to Harold Simmons, it's been Sophia's house for 3 years. We've apparently been living here at her grandmother's invitation, not as owners. Eric's face wrined. And you're just accepting that without a fight? What would you have me do? Dad asked wearily. Sue your sister? Contest your mother's wishes? Yes, Eric exploded. That's exactly what I would have you do. She's stealing your home. It was never their home to begin with, I said quietly. Grandmother inherited it from her grandmother. It's always been the Walker women's legacy, not the men's. This revelation clearly caught both men by surprise. Mr. Blackwell cleared his throat. Perhaps we should all sit down and discuss this calmly. The 4 of us moved to the living room where Mom appeared in the doorway, her eyes red from crying. I heard voices, she said. Eric, I told you not to bring lawyers into this. Someone has to fight for our family's interests, Eric snapped. Since Dad clearly won't, Mr. Blackwell opened his briefcase and removed several documents. Miss Walker, while the property transfer appears technically legal, we believe it could be successfully challenged on several grounds. The timing, the secrecy, the bypassing of direct descendants. My grandmother was of sound mind and body when she made her decision, I stated firmly. She had her reasons, which she documented extensively. Reasons like what? Eric demanded. What could possibly justify cutting out her own son and grandson? I hesitated, reluctant to reveal everything grandmother had told me about Eric's behavior. But his aggressive stance and the presence of his lawyer made it clear that holding back would only prolong the conflict. She knew about your meetings with Lakeside Developments, I said directly to Eric. She knew about the preliminary agreements you'd already signed using a power of attorney document that Dad signed, thinking it was for something else. Dad's head snapped up. What power of attorney? Eric's momentary flash of panic confirmed my suspicion. That was just for tax purposes, he stammered. To help manage your finances. It gave him authority to negotiate regarding your assets, I explained to Dad. Including this house, which you thought you owned, but actually didn't. Mom gasped. Eric, you didn't. The development would have benefited everyone, Eric insisted. The property values in this neighborhood are plummeting. This was a chance to cash out before it's too late. This house isn't a stock to be traded, I said. It's been in our family for generations. And what are you going to do with it? Eric challenged. Live here alone? Move your fancy Boston friends in for weekend parties. At least my plan kept it in the family. Your plan demolished half the original structure, I countered, including grandmother's rooms in the library. The lawyer was watching our exchange with increasing discomfort. Perhaps family matters should be discussed privately before we proceed with legal options, he suggested. There's nothing to discuss, Eric said coldly. She's made her position clear. Now we'll make ours clear in court, as if on cue. The doorbell rang again. This time it was Mrs. Patterson, grandmother's nurse, accompanied by Harold Simmons, the family attorney who had served the Walkers for decades. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, Mrs. Patterson said, but Eleanor asked me to come today. She said it would be about time for the fireworks to start. Despite the tension, Dad chuckled. That sounds like Mother. Harold Simmons nodded to Mr. Blackwell with professional courtesy before addressing all of us. I'm here to execute the final part of Eleanor Walker's wishes. She left a video to be played 1 week after her funeral. Or earlier if, as she put it, Eric starts making trouble. This is ridiculous, Eric sputtered. Some convenient video appearance from beyond the grave. It was recorded in my presence and notarized, Harold said mildly. Standard procedure for estate matters of this complexity. Mrs. Patterson produced a laptop from her bag. Eleanor recorded this 3 years ago, the same day she transferred the house to Sophia. We gathered around as the screen flickered to life, revealing grandmother seated in her favorite armchair in the library. Despite her age, she sat straight back and resolute, her blue eyes clear and direct. If you're watching this, she began without preamble. Then I've passed on and, as I suspected, there's a dispute about my decision regarding the house. She adjusted her glasses in the familiar gesture I'd seen thousands of times. I want to be perfectly clear about my reasons. This house has been passed from grandmother to granddaughter in our family since 1872. My grandmother bypassed my father and uncles to leave it to me, and now I'm doing the same. But it's not just tradition, she continued. It's about stewardship. This house needs someone who understands its value beyond dollars and cents, someone who appreciates its history and character. Her expression hardened slightly. Eric, I know you're watching this and probably fuming. I've seen the development plans you left in your car. I've overheard your phone calls about turning this property into condominiums. I know about the power of attorney document you tricked your father into signing. Eric shifted uncomfortably as his parents turned to stare at him. Richard and Margaret, grandmother, addressed my parents. I love you both, but you've allowed Eric to manipulate you for years. You've consistently chosen his wants over Sophia's needs, and I won't let that pattern extend to this house. Mom began crying again, while Dad looked stricken. And Sophia, grandmother's face softened. I'm entrusting you with not just a building, but a legacy. This house has sheltered 5 generations of strong Walker women. Now, it's your turn to decide its future. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze seemingly directed right at me across time. Whatever you decide, know that I trust you completely. You have the vision to see what this house could be and the strength to stand up for it. The video ended, leaving us in stunned silence. Even Eric seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Harold Simmons closed the laptop. There's also a letter for each of you to be read privately. And Miss Walker, he addressed me. There are additional documents regarding the trust fund established for property taxes and maintenance. Trust fund? Eric echoed incredulously. Yes, Harold confirmed. Your grandmother converted a significant portion of her investments to establish a trust specifically for the preservation of the property. It should cover expenses for approximately 20 years. The revelation that grandmother had thought of everything, had anticipated and planned for every contingency, was both overwhelming and comforting. She had given me not just the house, but the means to keep it. Eric stormed out without another word, his lawyer hurrying after him with briefcase in hand. The slamming door echoed through the house like a final punctuation mark. Mrs. Patterson touched my arm gently. She was so proud of you, dear. Every time you sent a letter or called, her whole face would light up. The simple statement broke something inside me. After maintaining my composure through confrontation and revelation, it was this small affirmation of grandmother's love that finally brought tears. Dad approached awkwardly, hands in his pockets. We'll still move to the rental, he said. Give you some space to figure things out, but I hope this doesn't mean we're cut off completely. It was the closest thing to an olive branch I could expect, and I recognized the effort it took him to offer it. Maybe Sunday dinners, I suggested tentatively. Once a month to start, Mom nodded eagerly, relief evident in her expression. We like that very much. As they returned, upstairs to continue packing, I stood alone in the foyer, feeling the weight of the house around me, not as a burden, but as a presence, alive with history and possibility. For the first time since returning to Millfield, I felt a sense of certainty. This was where I belonged. The house felt cavernous. The next morning, after my parents left for their rental, their departure had been awkward, but not hostile. Dad had handed over all the keys, and Mom had left a binder containing information about the utilities, local service providers, and the quirks of the old house's heating system. Small, practical gestures that spoke volumes about their acceptance of the situation, if not their happiness with it. I wandered from room to room, seeing the house with new eyes, not as the childhood home that had often felt constricting, but as an architect's canvas filled with possibility. The morning light streamed through the east windows, illuminating dust motes in the air and highlighting the intricate woodwork that had been handcrafted a century and a half ago. In grandmother's room, now empty of her presence, but still containing her furniture, I sat on the edge of the bed where she had read me stories as a child. The memory of her voice was so clear, I could almost hear it. Every house has a heart, Sophia. Find it, and you'll understand the whole structure. The writing desk, where she'd hidden her letter to me, stood in the corner. I ran my fingers over the smooth wood worn by generations of hands. Inside the drawer, I found more than I'd expected. Not just the envelope I'd already discovered, but a collection of letters from various family members over the years. Letters from my great-great-grandmother to her daughter, from my grandmother to her granddaughter. A continuous line of communication between the Walker women preserved like a time capsule. One letter dated 1972 caught my attention. In it, my great-grandmother wrote to Eleanor about her decision to leave her the house. The men in this family see property as wealth to be leveraged. We women understand that some things are valuable precisely because they are not for sale. The parallels to my current situation were striking. History wasn't just repeating itself. It was following a deliberate pattern established generations ago. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Patterson. "Tea this afternoon? There's more Eleanor wanted you to know." At 3, I found myself in Mrs. Patterson's cozy apartment above the town bookstore. At 76, she moved with the brisk efficiency of someone decades younger, setting out teacups and a plate of lemon cookies. "Your grandmother and I were friends long before I became her nurse," she explained, pouring Earl Grey from a floral teapot. "We met in the college library in 1968. Both of us studying when most women our age were focused on finding husbands. I didn't know grandmother went to college," I admitted. She never talked much about her youth. "Oh yes, she studied architecture. Actually," Mrs. Patterson smiled at my surprise. "She had to drop out when your grandfather fell ill, but she never lost her passion for buildings and design." This revelation stunned me. Architecture, like me. Why do you think she encouraged your interest so strongly? She saw herself in you, her unrealized dreams, finding new life. Mrs. Patterson reached into a drawer and pulled out a leather portfolio. "She wanted you to have this, said it should wait until after you dealt with the Eric situation, as she called it." Inside were architectural drawings, beautiful hand-rendered plans, and elevations for a community art center. The style was different from contemporary work, but the talent evident in the precise lines and thoughtful details was unmistakable. This was her thesis project, Mrs. Patterson explained. A plan to convert a historic home into a community space while preserving its character. The coincidence was too perfect to be merely chance. I looked up from the drawings. She knew, didn't she, what I might want to do with the house. "Eleanor had remarkable foresight," Mrs. Patterson said with a smile. "She didn't know exactly what you'd choose, but she knew you'd choose something that honored the house's soul." As I drove back to the Walker house, my house now, ideas began to form. Not just about the building itself, but about my life's trajectory. Boston suddenly seemed distant, not just geographically, but emotionally. The projects waiting for me there felt less compelling than the opportunity before me in Millfield. The buzzing of my phone interrupted my thoughts. Eric's name flashed on the screen. After a moment's hesitation, I answered, "Sophia." His voice was controlled, all traces of yesterday's anger carefully suppressed. "We need to talk. No lawyers, no parents, just us." "I'm listening, not over the phone. The Riverside Cafe in 20 minutes. I agreed, curious about this apparent change of approach. The Riverside Cafe sat on the banks of the small river that gave Millfield its name. In high school, it had been the place to go after football games or before dances. Now, it served as a quiet meeting spot for local business people and the occasional tourist. Eric was already seated at an outdoor table when I arrived, 2 coffees in front of him. He'd ordered mine correctly, black with 1 sugar, a small detail that reminded me we had once known each other well. "I've been thinking," he began without preamble, "about what grandmother said in the video, about you understanding the value of the house beyond money." I waited, unsure where this was leading. "I don't agree with her decision," he continued. "I still think it was unfair to bypass Dad and me, but I've consulted with another attorney and the transfer is solid. Fighting it would be expensive and probably futile. So you're giving up the legal challenge. I'm proposing a compromise." Eric leaned forward. "You keep ownership of the house, but we convert it together not into condos, but into something that serves the community while generating income on event venue perhaps, or a boutique hotel." I studied my brother's face, trying to discern his true motivation. "And what would your role be in this compromise?" "Business partner, you handle the design and preservation aspects. I handle the financial and operational side. 50-50. Despite his reasonable tone, I sensed the same old Eric beneath the surface, always looking for control, always positioning himself at the center of any venture. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully, "but I already have plans for the house." His expression tightened. "Let me guess, you're going to live there alone like some Gothic heroine, preserving it exactly as grandmother had it." Actually, I'm planning to convert part of it into a community art center and architectural studio. The plan was crystallizing as I spoke it aloud. The East Wing would be public space for exhibitions, classes, workshops. The main section would remain residential, Eric scoffed. And how exactly will that pay the property taxes? Or are you planning to live off grandmother's trust fund indefinitely? The studio would be a working architectural practice focusing on historic preservation and sustainable renovation. There's a growing market for that expertise, especially in towns like Millfield with aging but valuable housing stock. My brother stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. You've really thought this through? Some of it, yes. The rest is still forming. I took a sip of coffee. I'm giving notice at my firm in Boston next week. You're moving back to Millfield. The surprise in his voice was genuine. After spending your entire adult life trying to escape. I wasn't escaping Millfield, I corrected him. I was escaping our family dynamic. There's a difference. The honesty of this statement hung between us. Uncomfortable, but necessary. And what about Mom and Dad? Eric asked after a moment. Where do they fit into your grand vision? They're welcome to move back into the West Wing if they want. It would be their decision. Eric nodded slowly, processing this information. And me, Jessica, the kids, are we simply cut out? The question wasn't entirely fair, but it deserved a thoughtful answer. Your family, I said finally. The house will always be open to you as family, but not as business partners or co-owners. Grandmother made her choice for specific reasons, and I intend to honor it. He stood up abruptly. Well, I tried. Remember that when you're struggling to make this work, I offered a reasonable solution. It was reasonable for you, I acknowledged, but not for the house or for what grandmother wanted it to become. As I watched him walk away, I felt a curious mixture of sadness and relief. The rift between us wasn't healed, might never fully heal, but at least the battle lines were clearly drawn. There would be no more pretense of family harmony covering deeper machinations. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. I submitted my resignation to my Boston firm, arranged for my apartment to be subled, and began sketching preliminary plans for the conversion of the East Wing. Each evening, I sat in grandmother's chair in the library, surrounded by books that had witnessed decades of family history and felt increasingly certain about my decision. On Sunday, exactly 1 week after the confrontational dinner, my parents came for lunch. They arrived tentatively, as if unsure of their welcome in the house that had been their home for 3 decades. We've been thinking, Mom said as we sat in the sunroom with coffee after the meal, about what your grandmother said in the video, about how we favored Eric. Dad cleared his throat uncomfortably. We didn't see it that way at the time, but looking back, there were patterns we should have recognized. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. Perhaps the most I could realistically expect after years of established family dynamics. The past is past, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. What matters now is how we move forward. I showed them my preliminary sketches for the art center conversion. Dad studied them with genuine interest, pointing out practical considerations about the plumbing and electrical systems. Mom suggested which local artists might be interested in teaching workshops or displaying their work. Their engagement with my vision felt like the first step on a new path, not erasing our complicated history, but building something different alongside it. As they prepared to leave, I made an offer I hadn't planned, but which felt right in the moment. The West Wing has a suite with its own entrance and kitchenette. If you wanted to move back, that space could be yours, independent but connected. They exchanged glances, a silent communication honed by decades of marriage. We'll think about it, Dad said. But I could tell from his expression that the idea appealed to him. This house had been his mother's home after all. Despite our differences, there was a pull of belonging that wasn't easily severed. That evening, I stood on the wide front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. A text message from my former boss in Boston confirmed they would take me on as a remote consultant for specific projects, providing a financial bridge until my new practice was established. Piece by piece, a new life was taking shape. Not the one I had planned, but perhaps the one I had been moving toward all along without realizing it. As darkness fell, I turned to go back inside, the porch light illuminating my way home. 3 months passed in what felt like both an instant and an eternity. Spring had given way to summer, and the Walker house was undergoing its own transformation alongside the changing seasons. The East Wing, once formal and rarely used, now hummed with activity. The parlor that had hosted Victorian tea parties had become a gallery space, showcasing local artists. The former guest bedrooms were now workshop spaces where community members gathered for classes in painting, pottery, and architectural drawing. And the sunroom, with its abundant natural light, served as my architectural studio. My parents had accepted my offer to return to the West Wing. After a month in the rental, they'd found themselves missing the character and comfort of the old house. Now they occupied a suite of rooms with their own entrance, a comfortable compromise between independence and connection. The renovation process had been both challenging and rewarding. As an architect, I'd overseen numerous projects, but none had held the personal significance of this one. Every decision required balancing preservation with adaptation, honoring the past, while creating space for the future. Local contractors had initially been skeptical of my plans. "Never seen anything like this in Millfield," grumbled Frank Henderson, the electrician whose father and grandfather had serviced the town's buildings for generations. But as the vision took shape, skepticism gave way to enthusiasm. "It's like the old place is waking up," Frank admitted, as he installed energy-efficient lighting that complemented the historic fixtures. The community response had exceeded my expectations. In a town struggling with economic decline, the Walker House Art Center offered not just cultural enrichment, but a sense of possibility. Retired art teachers volunteered their time. High school students helped with the renovation in exchange for mentorship. A local business association approached me about designing similar adaptive reuse projects for other historic buildings downtown. Even Eric had grudgingly come around, though not without resistance. His legal challenge had fizzled out when his own attorney advised him of the slim chances of success. For weeks afterward, he had avoided family gatherings and refused to visit the house. But the birth of his third child, a daughter named Eleanor after a grandmother, had prompted a tentative reconciliation. "She should know her heritage," he'd said gruffly when he finally brought his family to see the renovated house. Watching his daughter toddle through the gallery space, touching the walls that had sheltered 5 generations of Walker women, I glimpsed a softening in my brother that I hadn't thought possible. Relations remained complicated. Years of resentment and rivalry couldn't be erased by a few months of change, but we were finding a new equilibrium, one based on clearer boundaries and more honest communication. The art center was officially opening to the public today. I stood in the entrance hall, making last-minute adjustments to the display, explaining the house's history and transformation. A large portrait of grandmother Eleanor hung prominently, her piercing blue eyes seeming to approve of what her legacy had become. Mrs. Patterson appeared beside me, elegant in a floral dress she'd worn for the occasion. "She would be so proud," she said, following my gaze to the portrait. "Not just of what you've done with the house, but of how you've stood your ground." "I had a good teacher," I replied, linking my arm with hers. The opening ceremony attracted more attendees than I had dared hope. Millfield residents who remembered visiting the house in my grandparents' day marveled at the thoughtful renovation. Younger community members explored the spaces with excitement about future programs. Local officials spoke about historic preservation and community revitalization. Even Mayor Thompson, initially skeptical about my big city ideas, acknowledged the project's success. "The Walker House has always been part of Millfield's identity," he said in his brief remarks. "Now it's helping us write the next chapter of our town's story." As the crowds mingled and explored, I found myself on the back terrace, taking a moment of quiet amid the celebration. The garden, once grandmother's pride, was thriving again under Mom's care. The fountain bubbled peacefully, just as it had during that fateful conversation 3 years ago. Dad joined me, handing me a glass of champagne. "Quite a transformation," he said, nodding toward the house, both the building and its owner. I smiled, recognizing the rare compliment. "I've been thinking about something grandmother used to say, that inheritance isn't just about property or money. It's about values, courage, vision." She was a wise woman. Dad acknowledged stubborn as hell, but wise. "I think that might be the real Walker women's legacy." I laughed. Stubborn wisdom. We stood in companionable silence, watching the sunset gild the old house with warm light. The building that had once felt like the center of family conflict now stood as a symbol of possibility and renewal. Later that evening, after the last guest had departed, I sat alone in the library, the one room I'd kept almost exactly as it had been in grandmother's time. The leather armchair creaked familiarly as I settled into it, a stack of letters in my lap, correspondence between Walker women across generations, passing wisdom and encouragement from one to the next. I'd learned so much in these past months about architecture and renovation, yes, but more importantly about family legacy and the courage to create boundaries. About standing firm in the face of intimidation and finding strength I hadn't known I possessed. About forgiveness that comes not from forgetting past hurts, but from refusing to let them dictate the future. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been sleepless nights questioning my decisions, moments of doubt about leaving my established career in Boston. Days when Eric's continued resentment had felt like an unbearable weight. But through it all, there had been a growing certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The house around me no longer felt like a battlefield or even primarily like an inheritance. It had become something more profound, a canvas for creating something new that honored what came before, a bridge between past and future, a home in the deepest sense of the word. As I prepared for bed that night, I paused by the window overlooking the garden where grandmother and I had had our last conversation. The moon silvered the landscape, casting long shadows from the ancient oak trees that had witnessed generations of Walker family dramas. "Thank you," I whispered to grandmother, to the house itself, to whatever combination of chance and choice had brought me to this moment. The journey wasn't over. There would be challenges ahead in making the arts center sustainable, in navigating family relationships, in balancing preservation with progress. But for the first time in years, I felt completely present in my own life, rooted in purpose and possibility. Some inheritances come with legal documents and property deeds. Others come in more intangible forms: courage, vision, the wisdom to recognize what truly matters. Grandmother had given me both kinds, and I was finally ready to claim them fully. What about you? Have you ever had to stand up to family for what you believed was right, or discovered an unexpected inheritance that changed your path? Share your story in the comments below. And if this tale of family drama and finding your own strength resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of transformation and resilience. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember, sometimes the most valuable legacies aren't things, but the courage to create your own path.